In this video, we're going to be talking about compiling games. So taking what you've built in Unity and creating an executable out of that people can actually play. So you've put together a game, and here's one that I've worked on a while back, and you want to compile it so your friend can play it, so you can put it on a website, use it as a portfolio piece, whatever else. And compiling is how we do that. You build your game once in Unity, and you can play it anywhere. That's sort of the logo, the motto of Unity. So Unity supports lots of platforms. It supports mobile devices, it supports PC, Mac, Linux, all the various consoles, a number of other things. Regardless of what you're going to be building, to build your game, you always start with the build settings screen. So that's where we'll start. And you can find that under File, Build Settings. And what you'll see in the bottom left is a bunch of different build targets. And again, you can create your game once in Unity, and then you can compile it out for these different platforms. Now, a number of these are going to be grayed out, and some of these are due to licensing issues. So especially for consoles and some of the other platforms, you have to actually talk to these companies and get set up as a developer, have a developer account to be able to create games for them. And with consoles, you actually have to have special hardware for testing and some other things. For things like, for instance, iOS or Android, by default, these modules are not installed when you install Unity. So they'll be grayed out, but you can go back to the Unity installer, you can select those modules, and Unity will install them. Now, a couple things to note kind of while we're talking about platforms. One is licensing issues. So most likely you are running Unity free. There is also a pro version of Unity. And you can compile for these various different platforms with Unity free, but there's a few restrictions. So if you want to start creating games and kind of using them commercially, whatever else, you need to be aware that, first of all, there's going to be a Unity splash screen and other things that kind of indicate this was created with the free version of Unity. And also there are limitations on how much money you can make. So the licensing states that you can use Unity free to make money. You can put your games out there, but if your company or if your combination of things that you sell in a year is greater than, I believe it's in the realm of $100,000 to $150,000, then you need to get the pro license. And you do need to get a base pro license and then an additional pro license for each platform that you want to compile to. So it can get somewhat expensive, but again, you don't have to do this until you're making $100,000, at which point a couple $1,000s for licenses really isn't that big of a deal. So, with all of these different platforms, we have to pick which one we want to compile for. And to start, we're just going to go with the basic standalone application that'll run on a computer, a laptop, whatever. So we're going to take a look quick through the options for this particular platform. And one thing to note is that each platform is going to have its own set of options. So when we want to build a game for a computer, first of all, we have to choose which operating system we want to compile for. And again, by default, these are not all installed when you install Unity, so you may need to go back to the module manager and install these various targets if you want to build for these different platforms. Within Windows, we can then choose x86, and x86 is a processor architecture. It deals with your CPU, and this is for 32-bit systems. You can also build for 64-bit systems. 32-bit is sort of backward compatible. It'll work on older versions of Windows, older versions of these other operating systems, but almost everything is 64-bit these days. And below that, you're going to see three options related to development builds. So if you check the first checkbox, the other two options become available. And these have to do with if you're having issues, if you want to be trying things in your compiled game, because sometimes you'll encounter bugs only in your compiled game. You won't see them in the Unity editor. You want to figure out what's going on. You can turn on development build, and with that, you can turn on some additional options that we won't need just yet, but will potentially be useful later in the course. And as I mentioned, there are different options for the different platforms. So for instance, if we go to Webgl, we see that we can set different optimization levels, although right now that option is grayed out. And again, for iOS, it's going to have its own options and so on and so forth. So for today, we're just going to build a PC, Mac, and Linux standalone. We're going to build for Windows. We're going to build a 64-bit game. Now, before we can actually build, we have to choose what to build. And this section up here contains a list of the scenes that you want to include in your build. by default, there's nothing selected. You can always click this button. This will add your open scene to the list. And then you can easily go through and grab whatever other scenes you want, and you can add them into this list. So a couple things to note about this part of the build settings. Only these scenes will actually be added to the build. So not all scenes in your project are going to be automatically added. And this is actually a very good thing, because typically you're going to have a couple of sort of main scenes for your game, and then you may want other scenes in order to do various setup things, or you may have scenes for testing, or you may have all kinds of scenes. And so just know that those are not going to bloat up your final build. You can create as many scenes as you want, and then you can select which ones are going to be actually compiled and placed into your built game. Another thing to note is that the ordering of these is somewhat important. When you first open the game, the very top scene is going to be the one that's immediately loaded. It's going to be the one with the index of 0. So you do want to make sure that whatever scene is at the top is your loading scene, your main menu, whatever scene you want to appear first. And then you're going to see two things for each scene. You're going to see a name for the scene, and you're going to see an index. And when we're loading different scenes, when we're moving through the game to different levels, through code, we can reference scenes either by the name or by the index. So that's another reason why the order here is kind of important, since I can say load scene 3, and it'll select it from the list. And if you want to change the order, you can just drag these and you can drop them in whatever order you want. And if you'd like to remove one, you can just click delete to remove it. So once we have that, we can actually go and create an executable of our game. And I'm going to go ahead and do that now. We do that with the build button at the bottom here. And when we click that, it's going to ask us where we want to export this. I'll just go ahead and pick a random folder, and then what name we want to name the game. Now, once it's compiled, you can change the name, but it's easiest to just choose the name that you want here. In this case, I'm just going to call this test build. And then I'm going to click save, and we're going to see a window pop up that's going to be building the player. And depending on the size of your game, this can take a while, because it's going to be compiling out all the scenes, it's going to be bundling up all of the assets, doing some compression, compiling all of your scripts for your target platforms. There's a lot of stuff kind of going on under the hood. All right, since this is somewhat of a larger project, I just went ahead and skipped to the end. So our game has finished compiling, and by default, Unity opens the folder where it was compiled to, and it selects the executable. So we can see testbuild.exe. Now, when you build your game, there's actually two things that are going to appear. You're going to see, and this is, by the way, specifically for Windows or for Mac, you're going to see different things depending on the different platforms that you compile for. So I have my testbuild.exe, and I also have this testbuild_data folder. And these two need to match. So testbuild needs to match what comes before the underscore here. So this is the executable that I click on to play the game, and I can do that. When I open it up, by default, it will show a configuration screen. We can put a logo for the game here. So I'll just go ahead and choose some screen size, and then click play. And once my game appears, we can see that just as we could in the editor, we can go ahead and play the game. So yeah, our game works just as it should. And you can then send this, again, to your friends for testing. You can stick this up on a website somewhere as a link to download, use a portfolio piece, etc. So we're going to be doing this a lot in class. Go ahead, if you have not yet, and pause the video and give this a try. Try and build a game before we proceed. So once you've done that, I want to show you real quick what's actually produced in the build, kind of what the structure of a compiled game in Unity is. And to see that, we're going to open up the data folder, and this is where a lot of the sort of magic is going to live. And within this, we're going to see a bunch of different objects. We're going to see that the assets inside of our game, so this is things like the 3D models, the audio, the textures, everything else, is going to be stuck inside of these various assets objects. So they're going to be compiled out, they're going to be zipped up, essentially, and then they're going to be stuck inside of these files. And then we're going to see a bunch of these subfolders. Under the Managed folder, we're actually going to see DLLs since we chose a Windows build, and this is actually the code in our game. So assembly C#.dll is all of the scripts that we've created, and in this particular game I've pulled in a bunch of external libraries. So I've referenced this other code that other folks have used and other folks have provided, and we were able to pull that into our game, and these appear, each one of these is basically a library. DLL is short for Dynamic Linked Library. Then we're going to also see some core stuff for Unity. So the Unity Engine Dll is the library that defines some of the stuff of how the Unity engine actually works. We'll actually be looking at this more in depth throughout the course. This particular game does a lot of networking, so I pulled in the Unity Engine.networking library as well. And then a lot of these other ones are sort of common to C#. So these are part of the .NET framework. System is a part of the .NET framework, and everything under it, like system.core, system.xml. So these are all different namespaces that we can access through our code. Beyond that, we have the core mono.dll. This is the library that sort of makes everything else work. And then we have some various resources and things that were pulled into our game because of specially named folders. We had a resources folder in Unity, and resources is a special name that Unity kind of knows what to do with. So the structure of this is directly created from the structure of our project. It's just that things are sort of bundled up and compiled out. Now this is specifically for Windows. When you're creating, for instance, for Mac OS X, it's going to create a .app, and that .app is going to be on OS X. It will be treated as if it were a file, but it's actually a folder. So you can open that up and it'll have a lot of the same things that we had in our data folder. Some of the other options that we have are things like Webgl. And Webgl is designed to work on the web, so this is going to produce a HTML loader page. There will be an HTML page inside of which your app will run, and then it's going to produce a bunch of JavaScript files and a bunch of zipped asset files that are going to be loaded in that way. iOS and Android, when you create for mobile, you actually go through an additional step to package things up for the phone. So you're going to build things out, and then you may go through, for instance, Xcode if you're building things for iOS. And there are various instructions and things for those online, and we'll get to those sort of a bit later in the course. So that, in a nutshell, is kind of all of the settings from start to finish to build a simple game. Now, in addition to all the settings related to the build, we have player settings. And this is this describes basically how our built game actually works. We have a bunch of control over the look and feel of our game, the various options, and rather than explaining it, I'll just go ahead and show it. So we can click this player settings, and in the inspector, we're going to see the player settings for our game. And there's going to be a section up at top, and these are going to be the same no matter what platform you're on. And then there are going to be tabs where you can switch between platforms. So for instance, if I want to create a Webgl game, then the options I'm going to see below are going to change. So let's do a real quick look through these. And then certainly in class and just on your own, you can ask me questions, and you can also look at the documentation, start playing around with these, see what these do. Now, one quick note is that these do sort of constantly change. Every new version of Unity, they seem to tweak one or two of these options. So this video may not match exactly what you see. I'll try and keep this updated, but if you see issues, if things are out of date, let me know, and I'm happy to redo the video if Unity decides to change too much. So let's go through the top step first. We have the company name and the product name, and this is metadata that will appear in the build. We have a default icon, and the icon is what will appear right here. So by default, if you don't select one, it's the Unity icon, but we can provide our own icon for our game. We can have a different cursor in our game, and then this specifies the hotspot, so where inside of the cursor you click, and we'll get into cursors a bit later. Then we have our resolution and presentation section specifically for our standalone build. So the first thing is resolution. So when you first open up the game, does it default to full screen? Does it default to a specific pixel width and height? When you tab away from it, does the game continue running or does the game pause? Standalone player options. Do we capture the screen? So this has meaning in terms of the OS, whether we capture the full screen or not. This option sets whether we disable or enable that resolution dialog. So when we double click on our test build, The resolution dialog is this thing that appears. If we don't like that, we can just go ahead and hide that, or we can disable it by default, and users can enable it using a key combination. Whether we want to output information to a log file, and that was something that I missed showing you. This output log.txt, just like we have the console in Unity that gives us log messages, you actually get log messages from the build. And this is immensely helpful in determining what went wrong when bugs happen, as bugs always will. And this is something that your players can actually send you this log file to help you diagnose what's going on. And if you go ahead and open this, then you'll see more information than you will in the player, because Unity hides a lot of things for you. So up at the top, this section is something you're always going to see, and this is where it's loading all of those DLLs we saw earlier. So it's just saying, hey, I'm loading the Unity Engine DLL, I'm loading this library, I'm loading this library, I'm loading this one. And then beyond that section, you'll have this input initialized, and beyond that, any output messages, any debug.log messages, or any errors, or anything else that happens with the running of your game will appear. Now, for the game that I built, it doesn't do any debug messages, but most likely, if you're creating these as you go, when you build your game, you'll see a bunch of these at the bottom. All right. Beyond that, whether the window can be resized is an option. You have some options specifically for when you're doing things on Mac. That doesn't matter for our particular build because I chose Windows. D3D9 and D3D11 deal with your graphics, your driver. And this is Direct3D or DirectX 9, Direct3D or DirectX 11. So these are specific to Windows. Mac does not use Direct3D or DirectX. They use OpenGL. Whether it's visible in the background, whether we can switch between full screen and not, the aspect ratios that we want to allow users to choose through that opening dialog window. The next section deals with icons. So again, we have our default icon, but we can override that and we can choose different sizes of icons. And these are important in certainly the newer versions of Windows, where they allow you to have not just icons, but sort of more mobile-inspired interfaces where you may need larger images. And then again, on mobile devices, you may need different sizes of icons depending on operating systems and other things. We have splash image information, and I am running Unity Pro, so I can turn off the Unity splash screen, but I don't believe that with the free version you can turn that off, so this will most likely be grayed out for you. And then other settings at the bottom. This section deals with a lot of advanced stuff, and a lot of this is kind of what do we want to include in the build? So the editor has the ability to do all kinds of things in terms of graphics and software, programming, libraries, all that kind of stuff. What do we want to include in the build? So rendering path has to do with lighting, color space has to do with rendering, different graphics API stuff, and all this stuff is going to be dealing with how things are being handled on the GPU. We are going to get into some of these things like static and dynamic batching in later videos. Other things like GPU skinning we may not specifically cover. This comes into play when we're doing things like character modeling. So characters have bones and they have muscles, and you move these things, and we can actually move that logic off of the CPU onto the GPU, and that can make things faster. Stereoscopic rendering is for things like VR. Configuration stuff, no option for Windows, but that can be changed. Define symbols, these are all sort of advanced things that you guys may not be quite ready for. API compatibility level, those default libraries that I showed you earlier, the .NET things like the system DLL and other things, we can actually reduce the number of those that are included in the build, and that makes the build smaller. But if we're trying to use those things, we'll run into bugs. So this is a question of functionality versus size. We can pre-bake and preload and do some things so that our game starts running a little bit faster. We can compress data. So these are all very useful, but these are all kind of more advanced options for your game. And I do encourage you to take a look at the documentation and perhaps when it's time, play around with some of these when you're doing your builds. And that concludes this video. These are all of the settings to be aware of when you're building your game. So again, just as a quick recap, you always start by going to File, Build Settings, which will open this Build Settings window. And we talked about all the build settings options. We need to set up our scenes, we need to choose our platform, choose the option for our platform. We can click on this Player Settings button to set some more advanced options. And when we're ready, we click Build, and that in turn will produce our output, which we can then stick in a zip file, put on a website, give to a friend, do whatever else with. And that covers compiling in Unity.